Now, this is part A of the Khoodeelaar television channel being broadcast only on the internet, not on satellite, not on terrestrial, from London at 10 minutes to 9 local time in London and 0850 hours GMT on Thursday, the 3rd of May, 3rd of June 2021. Now, this is the part of the Daily Mail. Now, this is the face hidden, the face of the killer of the black policeman in Belize. And this is such a contrast. There is a piece in the I newspaper there where the Channel 4 news presenter Cathy Newman is given a slot space at page 21, which is headed "Listen to Parm Sandhu to Tackle Police Racism" by Cathy Newman. Now, police racism in Britain and the black policeman murdered. The black policeman murdered in Belize. Now think about the contrasts. And we shall come to update on our commentary, world exclusive, original commentary on the state of, quote, policing in Britain. Now, Sandhu is standing up against the Metropolitan Police's denials of racism. Now, this is extraordinary because this kind of heading would not be acceptable or expected anywhere in Fleet Street, because it's not just the Metropolitan Police that is in denial of racism. The whole of Fleet Street is in denial of racism, and the whole of Fleet Street is in denial of racism in the police, racism of MPs, racism of the parties. So racism in the police is misleading, and racism of the Channel 4 is as rampant as racism of the police, Metropolitan Police. Now, having suffered, if you like, morally and ethically suffered the experience of having to watch the so-called re-election of Sadiq Khan in the name of London to the corrupt post of the elected mayor at the expense of London. Now, think about the words, the qualifying words and phrases that I'm using. It's not the mayor of London. No way. It is the corrupt post of mayor at the expense of the many in London, let's say. And Sadiq Khan, on his records, since he got slotted in 2016, the very year that Brexit happened, Sadiq Khan has been complete, absolute, and utter disaster. Where do you go from the disaster? You don't go anywhere because there is nowhere to go. Within the framework of the corrupt and degenerate democracy in Britain, there is no way that you can go anywhere. You can't go to the parliament, because parliament is completely corrupt, unrepresentative, and politically in a state of absolute inaction. So we've got in effect, a fascist status quo. There is no democracy, there is no accountability. And we shall come to the policing later. The so-called campaigners for the criminal project called HS2 have been showing that they are symbols. They're symbols of the absence of democracy in this country. And that most of the campaigners, as far as we know, apart from our campaign, which is independent of all of them, most of the campaigners against HS2 are racists. They're racists, and by definition, they're stupid. And by extension of that, they are not going to challenge any part of the status quo. These campaigners, who are in numbers about 50 or so campaigns that are regularly accessible online, which we check simply for the facts. These campaigners are almost all of them white, and they're racist, and they're ignorant, and they're stupid. Just like the so-called campaigners against the third runway, these are doomed to fail because of the racism. But they don't understand the impact, the very central impact, the central role of racism, their racism, in their role, in their behavior. So anyone who is factually interested in finding out about the HS2, you'll find that those so-called campaigners have not challenged any of the corrupt status quo in this country, in the government, in parliament, and in the corrupt judicial bureaucracies. And that's where the problem is. Because these so-called campaigners are liars, racist liars. They don't question the various post holders or careerists along the lines, either members of parliament or councillors or others with the vested interests in making sure that the HS2 criminality is perpetuated and perpetrated to the logical end, where there will be more than, this is currently the expenditure, the waste is around 102 billion pounds, current prices. But it will exceed that by many billions. It is impossible to exactly predict how many billions, but it will be. And there is no logic, there is no reason, there is no rationality. And the fact that the HS2 is on the table and it is going on shows the political murder of the Labour Party. And this is the reason why the Labour Party is complicit with the criminality of those who are pushing for the HS2 agenda and the big business interests. And so back to the status quo on racism in Channel 4, in Fleet Street, and the racism of Cathy Newman herself. And Cathy Newman is representing the same anti-Muslim prejudice in here that dominates Channel 4, the Metropolitan Police, the rest of the status quo. And the reason why I'm saying this is based on the facts. Because if either Cathy Newman or this Parm Sandhu. Well, Parm Sandhu is a novel name, it's a new name, but Kathy Newman has been around at least 10 years on Channel 4. And if Kathy Newman were really interested in even understanding racism in the police, she would have broadcast, in the last 10 years, she would have broadcast at least 1,000 items about the police racism in London and racism in the rest of the police forces in this country. But Kathy Newman is a racist, and she's an anti-Muslim racist, and she is doing a tokenistic job here. And she is doing a propaganda piece about herself. She's trying to come across as anti-racist. She's not. And this whole piece in the I newspaper, which you shall examine in thorough detail, is typical of the racism of Kathy Newman. So it's a claim. It's not a claim against racism. It's not a claim against racism, although the Kathy Newman piece is headlined or headed, Sandhu is standing up against the Matt's denials of racism. That's an absolutely untrue and factually unsustainable assertion in the headline and that or heading. And that actually proves that the people doing the subbing and editing, so-called the technical subbing and the technical editing of the I newspaper, are themselves ignorant. They're ignorant at all levels concerned, because this is based on a series of claims of discrimination brought against the Metropolitan Police by Parm Sandhu. So let's read the first paragraph of Kathy Newman promoting Parm Sandhu and herself. Imagine it's your first day in a new job, and the blokes in the office decide to turn you upside down so they can brand your bum with the office rubber stamp. It sounds horrific, even scarcely believable, but that was just the first in a catalogue of sexist and racist incidents that Parm Sandhu, one of Scotland Yard's most senior ethnic minority officers. Now that phrase, most senior, and the other phrase, ethnic minority officers, these are misleading, untrue, and we shall diagnose each one in due course. One of Scotland Yard's most senior ethnic minority officers says she experienced in her 30-year career. This week on Channel 4 News, she spoke out for the first time since she took her employers to a tribunal and agreed a financial settlement. She told me, that is Kathy Newman, who presents Channel 4 News, that contrary to the Met Commissioner Dame Cressida Dick's denial of institutional racism, she believed the force was now more racist than after the inquiry into the death of Stephen Lawrence. We have been saying that racism has been increasing at unprecedented rate in Britain over the last few decades. And it might be easy to dismiss the bum branding as something that belongs to a chauvinistic past. But her accusations against Scotland Yard are shockingly contemporary, too. In 2018, after she applied to become a chief superintendent, she was called to a security vetting interview to discuss your Indian heritage. The implication, she told me, was that despite being born and bred in Britain, her background placed a question mark over her loyalty to her home country. The Met has since apologized to her. Sandhu's mantra throughout her career has been, "Don't let the bastards grind you down." But despite her settlement, it's hard to escape the conclusion that the bastards might have won. Now, instead of bastards, what in the context of all of this would be the more appropriate word and concept and term? It would be racist, wouldn't it? Or racists in a plural instead of bastards in a plural. Her background placed a question mark over her loyalty to her home country. Home country is Britain. Sandhu's mantra throughout her career has been, "Don't let the bastards grind you down." But despite her settlement, it's hard to escape the conclusion that the bastards might have won. Having risen to chief superintendent level, she has left the job she loved, and according to Sandhu, although there are a lot of police officers who are good, who are kind, and who are there for the right reasons, there is a core of police officers who are racist. But now she is getting her own back, raising her voice to shame those who she says stood in her way, and she reserves her hardest criticism for Dame Cressida. I think that she is so far removed from reality, so far removed from real operational policing, she doesn't know anymore, she told me. She either doesn't know or she chooses to ignore it. Institutional racism exists in the Metropolitan Police, and it's alive and kicking, and is worse now than straight after the Macpherson inquiry. Now, Macpherson inquiry was called the Macpherson inquiry after the retired member of the judiciary who was appointed as chair of that inquiry into the police behavior over the murder, the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence in April 1993. That's quite a claim, and I asked Sandhu for evidence to back it up. She cited the sheer number of ethnic minority officers who find themselves under investigation. If you are a black officer, you are about 3 times more likely to be investigated internally. She herself faced gross misconduct charges for lobbying on her own behalf to receive a Queen's Police Medal. She was cleared after an investigation. The Met told Channel 4 News, Palm Sandhu is a successful former Metropolitan Police officer. Prior to her retirement, she was one of our most senior operational leaders. The Commissioner's record on issues of race and discrimination speaks for itself, and she is deeply committed to continuing to build a service that reflects those it serves. Now, remember, there is no phrase in that quotation about opposing racism, ending racism, being opposed to racism, condemning racism. There is none of that. So that is an admission of what Palm Sandhu is saying. And we'll comment on Palm Sandhu herself after reading the rest of this piece. The legal matters between the Met and Miss Sandhu are private. The Metropolitan Police has made no admission of liability in respect of claims of discrimination against Ms. Sandhu, that's unquote. And then Kathy Newman writes, in her memoirs, Black and Blue, One Woman's Story of Policing and Prejudice, out next week. So that's the connection with this publicity. She recalls, the Ripam Sandhu recalls, my mother warned me never to buy a house of my own because people would break my windows. I chose not to believe that. In the end, it turned out that my mother was right. If you come from where we come from, there are always people who want to break your windows. The Met now needs to prove her mom wrong. And this is a piece not originally published in the I, which has copied this. It is originally published online on the Independent. Now we shall go back to that. Now, going back to Pam Sandhu being given this publicity by Kathy Newman and the Independent and Channel 4 News, let me remind anyone who has been watching this program for a while, or tell them if they haven't been watching, that I have made a very long investigation into the Metropolitan Police right from the beginning. And the Metropolitan Police, since my first encounter with it, has disappeared. There is no police service in London. There is no police that I can kind of refer to in the last 20 years or plus, or even 30 years. When I first came across the Metropolitan Police in London, it was in the early 1970s. And there was an incident of a racist man in the building, in the house next door to where I was at the time, that made a racist kind of series of comments directed at me. Although he couldn't see me, he could hear me, and he was making racist comments. So I called the police, which is the 999 call at the time, and two white Met police persons arrived. And they arrested this man immediately. Now that is how it should be, because he was making threatening racist comments at somebody who has nothing to do with them, and I was not in contact with them whatsoever. That is now impossible to imagine. What is possible to imagine is that if somebody makes a complaint against the police, against the racist behavior of somebody, then the complainant, if they are Asian or African, are more likely to be arrested themselves. Now, there is nothing at the local level in London, in Tower Hamlets, in the borough level. There is nothing at the what is called the Greater London Assembly, or the Metropolitan Police Authority, which is supposed to be the part of the responsibility of the incumbent in the corrupt post of the mayor at the expense of London. And there is nothing in Parliament, there is nothing in the central government that actually deals with policing, policy, policing conduct, policing misconduct, policing racism, policing failures, policing corruption. All of these are not mine. These are factors and issues that have been raised by at least 100 different police persons, either Asian background or African background, and especially by Muslims. And the fact that Kathy Newman doesn't refer to the most brazen sets and incidents of racism by the Metropolitan Police, which is witnessed and evidenced in the police's racist and anti-Muslim behavior against Muslims, shows Cathy Newman's true identity and true affiliation. She is against Muslims as well, as is the rest of Fleet Street. The broadcasting counterpart, which is Channel 4 News, is like Fleet Street in political policy terms, except in technical terms about the need for the broadcasting outlets to have more verifiable evidence before they broadcast something. So Cathy Newman is in this promotion of Parm Sandhu, who looks like she is of Sikh or Punjabi origin, is like the treatment by Private Lie, and especially by the late Paul Foot. It's a one-off treatment that Paul Foot made in terms of even referring to the police corruption. And Paul Foot's subject was, of course, Girpal Vardi. Now, Girpal Vardi is a Punjabi origin person, a Sikh person, I think. So these are the only two Asian Metropolitan Police, ex-Metropolitan Police employees or police persons who have received anything like a near kind of normal, near objective coverage and treatment by Fleet Street. Paul Foot, although he was publishing about Girpal Vardi, mainly in Private Lie, he behaved like a member of the ordinary Fleet Street. And he was a Fleet Street person at the time as well, that he also contributed to Private Lie. So that shows the status quo is definitely a racist and brazenly established anti-Muslim agenda and narrative and purpose and orientation. Whatever the description, the fact that the Metropolitan Police is being accused by this person, Parm Sandhu, although she has done the settlement and the police have denied making any admission of liability. The fact of the dysfunction and the dysfunctioning nature, unfit nature of the police in London is not a matter of speculation. It's not dependent on whether there is an item about that on Channel 4 News or not. Everyone who is out and about, who is familiar with London street life, public life, and is a member of the community or the population, whether they're born in Britain or not, but with the background, either Asian or African, knows that the police are not fit for purpose whatsoever. And the other thing is that the police, when you see police, if you see the police, it is on rare occasions, high-profile events, and the police are not there in mixed ethnic kind of representation. Most of the deployment of the police and the demonstrations, etc., are white police. So, although it is true that there are members of the police with Asian or African backgrounds, those African and Asian police are not there in the deployed police presence. And Sadiq Khan is absolutely silent about all of that. But then Sadiq Khan is silent about everything. Everything that he should be vocal about, he should be politically, democratically, ethically, morally active about, Sadiq Khan is dead. So although he has not been politically murdered by Keir Starmer, of whom he is a positive supporter, incidentally, Sadiq Khan is a disaster for London democracy, London society, London people, and the human rights violations that are taking place by the Metropolitan Police, which, as an example of institution, is the institution with given the most power in the name of society without any accountability. So we shall be continuing on the need for police to be brought into action to defend safety, to protect lives, and to protect democracy. Because the Boris Johnson's fascist move to give the police more powers is so brazenly stupid and unjustifiable, because there is no need for more power for the police. The police have got extremely extensive powers against individuals, against society, against groups, and there is nothing in parliament, nothing in government, and nothing in Fleet Street's records that shows that the police are very, very urgently in need of being held to account for the sake of society, for the safety of society. So we shall be having to look at the police more as the topics come up. And we say that because Parm Sandhu has never been heard of as a campaigner against racism until she decided to make a case of her own. Now the picture of the woman shown on the left of the screen is, of course, a heavily disguised kind of killer of the black policeman in Belize. Nothing has been published to our knowledge so far at this time about why she was meeting him on her own and why he was meeting her on his own at that time of the night. So it would be only speculation that they had a sexual relationship, although this has been carefully denied in advance by the managers of the news that has so far been published. But there must have been something very personal between them. Absolutely no doubt whatsoever. And it's only a matter of time before the details are admitted. While the details are being awaited, the role of the conservative, the corrupt conservative, what they call billionaire, in almost getting away with this murder by paying money and owning everyone there, is already on the record. Now this is a 2-page spread from Tom Leonard in Belize, and the main 2-page heading is that this is not justice, and this is not justice at all. But the facts are that on the island where his son's partner is charged with shooting dead a police chief. Now, this woman has been persistently misdescribed either as a partner or common law wife or wife of Michael Ashcroft's son. So reading again, on the island where his son's partner is charged with shooting dead a police chief, billionaire Lord Ashcroft paid for a police gym and a facility at her jail. Her lawyers Her lawyer is the ex-Attorney General of Belize, whose wife is the Parliament Speaker. Now, as the case could be resolved with just a fine, the victim's family claim this is not justice. So this is not the truth. This is not even 5% of the truth. A lot of facts will come out. And this is a piece, although they're saying this is not justice, this piece in the Mail is full of praise for both Ashcroft and the killer of the black policeman. So the description of the Daily Mail as a corrupt, racist, lying organ is justified again. Now, about the Nepal variant, what they're saying, foreign holidays are under threat because ministers are worried about a new COVID variant, the Mail can reveal now. Before going into the variant, let's raise the question about foreign holidays. Anyone watching this from outside of Britain or from a country or location that is directly experiencing hardship and poverty and is not aware of what is called holidays, foreign holidays, because of lack of funding and access to other means that a holiday require. Foreign holidays cannot be the reason why pandemic related policy should be decided. Secondly, for most people in Britain, Britain including Northern Ireland, Wales, and Scotland, and England, and Cornwall, most people in these parts of the UK cannot afford holidays, not by a long stretch. In any case, holidays are not part of normal life. Holidays, by definition, last only a few days or weeks at the most. And that applies to those who can spend the money. So I think that a moral, ethical, and responsible newspaper would give the statistics, the data as to how many people go on holiday every year, or how many people can go on holiday and how often, and the factors as to why most people cannot go to holiday or on holiday. That would give the picture. Otherwise, foreign holidays is a completely contemptible stupidity. Foreign holidays for whom? Who are the people? And given the latest kind of findings by the organization called which they're surveyed about income and the basic amount of money that people need to exist day to day, the basic minimum amount is 26,000 pounds or around 30,000 pounds. But that is well beyond what most people in the many categories receive by any kind of income. And this is a deadly area of darkness and denial that Keir Starmer, the political murderer of the Labour Party, is silent about. And the same applies to Jeremy Corbyn. Those who want to rush to celebrate my condemnation of Keir Starmer must not rush. Because as I say, Corbyn is intellectually very challenged and politically very stupid, as I have chronicled and updated. There is no culture among the so-called Labour Party MPs in the House of Commons of campaigning. What there is a very small number. And currently the small number includes 5 or 6 Labour Party MPs who are either Asian or of African origin, women. One from Nottingham is Nadia Whittam, and one from another part of the north, Zara Sultana. These are the two that are given more space or more mentions in the mainstream media than the others, for example. But that's not enough. There are hundreds of Labour Party MPs. And a country which has got millions of people in poverty and denial and are being disenfranchised and are rotting, in fact, in denial and deprivation and poverty and hunger. There should be a daily campaign drawing attention to all of that, and there is none. And the same applies to the Fleet Street papers, the liars of Fleet Street. And the Daily Mail is having a go at Meghan Markle because they know the racists in Fleet Street and racists in the service of Brenda's royal family know that Meghan Markle might pursue a political career. Being an American-born person, she is entitled to have a political career. And in order to limit the damage that a politically kind of established person might represent against the racist British royal family and Fleet Street and the establishment, they're making preparations to have a go at her. And the Daily Mail has employed Craig Brown in the cover of a satirical piece, Study Notes for a A-Level in Political Studies, 2050-51, President Markle, Meghan, Hard Truth and the Path to Victory. Hard Truth. So they're denying Meghan the right to claim to be truthful about anything. That if she tells the truth or insists on telling the truth, then it is hard truth. That means that it's not really the truth. So they're condemning her through that. So we shall be talking more about Fleet Street's racist obsession against Meghan Markle. and what we have said about Narendra Modi in India, and we have said, of course, against the similar tactics by Boris Johnson fronted cabal and by Boris Johnson personally in lying about the extent of the impact on the population of the pandemic in each of the countries. So Financial Times is saying in notebook on page 20 of today that New Delhi's data dissembling is harming India. Now that's a belated realization. Of course it is. And what they should be saying and what they're not saying, and the reason why we continue to be justified in calling it the financial crimes, is because they are not saying that the entire project of the Hindutva fundamentalist Brahminist regime, as fronted currently by Narendra Modi and as previously fronted by Atal Bihari Vajpayee, is a denial of the most mundane definition of democracy. The democracy that the British media, Fleet Street, and the British Parliament went out of their way to promote and praise Jawaharlal Nehru for. And they still persist in calling the demography, the India, the world's largest democracy, which is absolute lie. And the reason why such a large number of Indian people have been killed by the pandemic is to do with the fact that the federal state of India has been overly quoted, that is to say, promoted and praised by the establishment in the West, and especially as misled by the Fleet Street, British Parliament, and British governments. Because the federal government in India has never been bothered about addressing the hundreds of millions of Indians with democracy, with safety, security, equality. None. So a regime and a system that are founded on lies and denials and fabrications, they're bound to cause damage and harm to the hundreds of millions of Indians that are affected by those misdeeds and impunity. So we're going to look at some of today's headlines or main items carried in the English language ones, that for the purpose of the viewers of this program, that we shall access in English language, because if we do the other languages, then viewers who are mainly relying on English would not be able to follow. So we shall look at the English language ones. There is a piece in the Hindu about the impact of a series of cyclones on the part of the Sundarbans. Now, they are, of course, talking about Sundarbans that is within India, but the same impact has been felt by the part of Sundarbans that is in Bangladesh. And the bit that the item in the Hindu by Shiv Saha Singh or Shiv Saha Singh, Sahe Singh, filing from Kolkata, reads, for people in the ecologically fragile Sundarbans, life revolves around battling high tides daily and cyclones regularly. But every cyclone throws up the new challenges to the Sundarbans and its inhabitants, so melting something the people had not imagined, the policymakers are not prepared for. Over just the past 3 years, the Sundarbans, which is home to close to 5 million people, has been battered by 4 tropical cyclones. Fani in May 2019, Bulbul in November 2019, Amphan in May 2020, and Yas in May 2021. On each occasion, the region has suffered damage because of gale winds and breached embankments, leading to ingress of seawater. The intensity of the gale winds has ranged from 100 kilometers per hour to 150 kilometers per hour during each of the cyclones. Experts say the solution to the perennial problem lies in long-term planning, adapting strategies that will minimize the impact of the climate change and disaster management suited to the region. When the state administration launched a massive evacuation drive earlier this week on May 24th and May 25th, little did the residents know that though the cyclone Yas made landfall about 200 kilometers south of the Sundarbans in Odisha, it would inundate large areas of the estuary. The cumulative effect of the full moon tide on May 26th and the cyclone led to the overflowing and breach of embankments in large areas of the Sundarbans. While the India Meteorological Department had predicted a storm surge of 2 miles above the or 2 meters above the astronomical tide level, water in the river and bay swelled to full moon tide. As a result, on May 26th morning, as Cyclone Yas made landfall, large areas were inundated. Now, this is a description by the Hindu, which is, this one is dated the Sunday, the 30th of May edition, the last Sunday. And it's the front page piece in the Hindu. It doesn't actually report the truth about India, the central government, because the parts of Odisha, West Bengal, and all the states, Assam, and the northeastern small states surrounding Bangladesh, are treated by the New Delhi-based federal government as part of outlying colony of another state, India. And we shall talk about that as we try to explain the evidence of why the Sundarbans have been neglected by the Indian central government. And we shall environmentally, ecologically, also discuss the absence of the necessary action by the regime that is supposed to be the regime in the name of protecting Bangladesh. And we shall talk about the Hindutva and Brahminists' treatment of Assam as a foreign country as part of the agenda of anti-Muslim hostility and denial and deprivation. And we shall also refer to the silence of the United Nations on what is going on in Assam and against Bangladesh and against the Muslims by the Burmese. The United Nations bureaucracy is totally dishonestly deployed to reinstate the image of Aung San Suu Kyi, and to do so by painting her as the victim of the Burmese army's latest coup. And that is the cover to hide the liabilities of Aung San Suu Kyi and others in her regime when the genocide took place against the Rohingya Muslims. And then we shall talk about the United Nations failure, about Bashan Chor and how the government of Bangladesh was allowed to effectively deport these thousands of Rohingyas to this completely unsafe, environmentally unsafe and otherwise unsafe remote region, artificial island called Bashan Chor. And we shall expose the stupidity and the incompetence and the negligence of the United Nations Secretary General himself and of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, this Chilean ex-president of Chile, Michelle Bachelet. However you pronounce the Bachelet. I'm not doing the Spanish or the French, wherever the name Bachelet is from. And so we go back to India and we talk about extent of the Narendra Modi caused surge in the COVID now. Now on page 2 of the Hindu of Sunday, it is reporting that the count of the infected people in the south, like Coimbatore records 3,692 infections, while Chennai, formerly known as Madras, counts 2,705. And the whole state logs 30,016 cases. And the majority of the items there are about the infections in India. So there is a piece in the Hindu of the 30th of May 2021 by Dr. Gagandeep Kang, professor of microbiology at the CMC, Velo, explaining the implications of the changes made in the midst of the second wave. And I shall read the kind of conclusion. And she is giving a and the Hindu is like a continuation of the pre-August 1947 mode. It hasn't experienced the last 75 years, 74 years, let's say. Its attitude to the people, their attitude to readers, attitude on India, although it's mainly written by Indians, remains completely artificial and false. So it's no point in reading the actual text, literally the actual text. And I shall try to see if I can find the Times of India, the Hindustan Times. Now, the Supreme Court in India, according to the Hindustan Times of today's date, that is Thursday, the 3rd of June, is saying that the Supreme Court has said that the India's vaccine policy for 18 to 45-year-olds is arbitrary, irrational. Now, this arbitrary and irrational could be said about everything that Modi is doing. Okay? So that doesn't require a Supreme Court hearing, does it? Everyday experience says that is the case. And the Supreme Court has made 10 points, 10 key points, as the Hindustan Times calls it. Number one, vaccination of India's entire eligible population is the singular most important task. Number two is paid system of inoculation for states is prima facie arbitrary and irrational. Policy conflicts with the constitutional balance of responsibilities between center and states. Existing vaccination policy should be tested on N bill of right to equality under Article 14, which means the right to equality under Article 14 are being violated by Modi. Why can't center, that is Modi, spend 35,000 crore from budget to vaccinate 18 to 45 year age group? Number 6, current policy benefits. Reading again, number 6. Current policy benefits economically privileged sections of society. Is that a news? Of course, most Indians are being denied basic rights. They have been denied basic rights for 74 years, since August 1947. Marginalized sections in India will bear the brunt due to mandatory registration of co-win. Number 8, place all documents, file notings to show thinking behind the vaccination policy. Undertake a fresh review of the vaccination policy. Number 10, submit all data on inoculation done and plan to vaccinate rest of the populace in 2 weeks. This is just a sample. The details of Modi's failures are horrifyingly, alarmingly widely known to most people in India. Now, there is an advertisement on the front page of the Hindustan Times today featuring Amitabh Bachchan by the Reserve Bank of India. And it says, in case of an unauthorized transaction on your card, inform your bank immediately to limit your losses. Now, that shows that on the internet, crimes are being committed every day and everywhere, as we can testify, and we shall be doing that later. We're going back to, or moving back to the Financial Times, and it is the death, the political murder of the Labour Party by Keir Starmer. The Financial Times is belatedly waking up to, months after we started openly saying that Keir Starmer had politically murdered the Labour Party in Britain. And this is a piece by Robert Shrimsley. Robert Shrimsley is saying, when Tony Blair offers a view on how to win elections, it is worth paying attention. In recent weeks, the former UK Premier has been one of a number of left-leaning figures. Now, that is absolutely untrue. He's never been left-leaning at all. Seeking to resurrect the dream of an electoral pact with other parties, a so-called progressive alliance, to defeat the Conservatives. Writing last month, Tony Blair, who has long blamed the historic split between Labour and the Liberal Democrats for decades of near-conservative hegemony, called for a new dialogue. Quote, otherwise we will be in the dreary business of fighting with a cause which is unclear. Our hands tied behind our back on a ground we didn't choose in a battle. We can't win. Now, this is too simplistic a summary, which we shall need to can examine. And Robert Shrimsley then goes back to his writing after the quote. This view was echoed by former Green leader Caroline Lucas, Labour's Clive Lewis, and the Liberal Democrats' Laila Moran, as they backed a three-party non-compete pact to end the self-defeating tribalism, splitting the left vote. Labour opposition to separation precludes Welsh and Scottish nationalists. A report for the campaign group Compass identified 48 Conservative seats where the combined progressive vote Well, this particular summary sounds quite realistic in terms of the number of seats affected. And we are not talking about the ideology, but just the seats. Let's continue a bit more. A report from the campaign group Compass identified 48 conservative seats, where the combined progressive vote exceeded the Tory total, enough to rob the government of its majority. Now, as I said, there are two different aspects to this. One is this simply removing the Conservatives as the majority kind of party in the House of Commons. That is not the same thing as any agreement between the alliance parties on ideology, on agenda, on manifesto, on policy. So remember that. Such talk is seductive, especially to those who prefer to focus on the unfairness of the first past the post system rather than any intrinsic lack of electoral appeal. But it is true that since 1979, Labour has won just 3 of the last 11 elections, all under Blair. The scale of the defeat in 2019 means victory at the next election is already unlikely. That is, and Robert Shrimsley, not Anthony Shrimsley continuing, yeah? But even allowing for the added credibility of the support of Labour's one living election winner and setting aside internal obstacles, there are 4 reasons why a progressive alliance is, for now, at least a dead end for Labour. First, parties do not own voters. If they pull out of a seat, a sizable chunk of supporters will not simply do as they are told. Voters object to stitch-ups or being taken for granted. While activists may think in such a term as progressive, most citizens do not define themselves in this way. Those who do already understand active, tactical voting. There may come a time nearer the election when some kind of arrangement is worth examining. But Labour's core task is to get itself in order and start looking like a party its lost voters are prepared to see in power. Electoral pacts are no substitute for electability or electability. Now, we haven't read the whole piece by Robert Shrimsley, but essentially what he's saying is that the Labour Party has to get itself in a state of fitness for the electors to trust them and the electors to actually trust them enough to vote for them in such large numbers or significant numbers as to make them credible and elected. Now, to do all of that, there has to be life, and the Labour Party is now lifeless. And Robert Shrimsley, tasting the bits that I have read already, does not believe that the Labour Party is dead. He thinks that the Labour Party is alive. That is where Robert Shrimsley is making the mistake. And we shall return to the Labour Party and Starmer and the state of Little England, that is the center of the rot. Okay, so we go back to Narendra Modi and he's lying about the numbers affected now. Given that the headline, the piece is byline to Amy Kazmin, this is not likely to be a truthful article. Amy Kazmin is a corrupt, dishonest careerist cited and situated in New Delhi. And she capitulates to and colludes with the agenda of Narendra Modi, despite the occasional appearances to the contrary she puts on in order to come across as being able to catch up with and reflect the current tendency, reluctant tendency to find any fault with Modi at all. So let's see what Amy Kazmin is saying. As India's devastating COVID-19 second wave peaked last month, its daily death toll hit a record of more than 4,500. 4,500 people dying every day. That day, Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government hailed a landmark achievement, trumpeting that more than 400,000 Indians received from COVID in a single day. The bizarre claim of success, which only emphasized the vast numbers stricken by the virus, reflects New Delhi's creative use of data to bolster its image. By New Delhi, read Narendra Modi and BJP. Modi has his ruling Bharatiya Janata Party treat data as an important input for a political narrative about Modi leading India to its rightful place in the pantheon of world powers. Inconvenient figures that may undermine these claims are either twisted or buried by Modi. She's not saying Modi, but that's what she means. The BJP understands. The common man in general doesn't really understand data, says political consultant Shibam Shankar Singh, author of How to Win an Indian Election. The common man these ones, let's read this one again. They decide that the dominant narrative should be, the BJP understands that the common man in general doesn't really understand data, says political consultant Shibam Shankar Singh. Why does she have to refer to Shibam Shankar Singh? If she lives in India, why can't she speak to Indian ordinary people? Think about that. So read it again. The BJP understands that the common man in general doesn't really understand data, says political consultant Shibam Shankar Singh, author of How to Win an Indian Election. Starting quotation again. They decide what the dominant narrative should be. They try to find data that would support it, and they try to suppress data that would counter it. By they, of course, Shibam Shankar Singh is saying the BJP and Narendra Modi. Modi's government had fraught relations with data even before the pandemic. Before India's last general elections, New Delhi stopped the release of unemployment data that showed Modi's failure to deliver on promised job creation, prompting the head of the National Statistics Commission to resign. Estimates of gross domestic product growth under the BJP were also revised sharply upwards, leading top economists to warn that the statistical machinery was controlled by political considerations. Well, that is a very mild way of putting it. It's theft, it's corruption, it's robbery by Modi. But COVID-19 has brought political number management to the fore. You have had a focus on whatever metric or measure of the pandemic appears to create the most optimistic narrative, says mathematician Murad Banaji of Middlesex University, London. India's acknowledged 335,000 COVID-19 deaths, including 170,000 in the last 2 months, have been portrayed as statistically insignificant, little consolation for families that have lost loved ones. And what she's saying in the end is that rather than lead to more transparency, the COVID-19 surge in India is likely to reinforce Modi's penchant for secrecy and spin. Ministers now claim all Indians will be vaccinated by December, though they have not offered any credible roadmap. They have never been transparent with data and information, and after this, their natural instinct is going to be to control it even more, predict Singh. They just tell you how amazing the future is going to be. Now, this is this woman called Amy Kazmin. Amy Kazmin is a liar. There is not a single Western media person based in India, anywhere, in Delhi or in Mumbai or in Calcutta, which is the least of the three as the popular kind of location. All of these are liars. And the financial crimes should have found by now a way to tell the truth about India, despite the fact that they have got this Amy Kazmin based in India. And there are many people in India, individuals in India, that the financial crimes can contact with credible access to information about the actual truth on the ground. But the financial crimes editorially refuses to tell the truth by seeking the truth in that way, as I have suggested. And the entire edition of the financial crimes today, as is the edition every publishing day, 6 days of the week, is full of denial of the truth about the financial crimes and financial reality and the behavior of big business and the factors that cause large numbers of the many to lose out on everything, including health, housing, basic rights, human rights, in the UK, in the West, and in the rest of the world. That's the financial crimes. And as I said, Amy Kazmin is a New Delhi-based liar. And we shall be talking more about Amy Kazmin and what she symbolizes. This Amy Kazmin is a woman with a degree from California and a postgraduate degree from the London School of Economics in economic history. And she has been previously based in Bangkok, in Thailand, and has got almost 2 decades of experience of covering up the truth about Asia, South Asia. Amy Kazmin is not fit, but then most of the Fleet Street reporters are not fit for the purpose of telling the truth to the readers and the public. Let's see what the Guardian has to offer. Now, the Guardian says that for 200 years, the Guardian has been telling the truth. It is absolute lie. For 200 years, the Guardian has been imitating the main liars of the status quo state. And it says, shock for Boris Johnson as school czar resigns. I mean, whenever a title calls Boris Johnson PM, it makes the ridiculous Johnson come across as being other than ridiculous. And it makes the Guardian looks even less credible. And they've got a piece about this woman, Sachin Littlefeather, one of the original Nations people in Hollywood. And we shall come to that original Nations later. The Guardian has got a piece that claims that Generation Z, a generation feeling betrayed and ready to fight back. The COVID crisis has devastated lives across all age groups, but today, a Europe-wide project reveals the particular toll the pandemic has taken on the young. And the other piece on the front page is, of course, about archives. Archives reveal ban on black staff at Buckingham Palace. Well, they don't say Buckingham Palace in the heading, but that's what they mean. Now, this is the first paragraph of that piece. The Queen's courtiers banned colored immigrants or foreigners from serving in clerical roles in the royal household until at least the late 1960s. According to newly discovered documents that will reignite the debate over the British royal family and race. Well, that is a completely stupid paragraph. It should say that there has been new admission of the racism of the British monarchy. Because British royal family and race takes away the responsibility from the racist royal family for racism. Now, what are they going to say? Are the Daily Mail, the scum, the Daily Beaverbrook, going to say that that is the case? They're not going to say that is the case. They're going to find a different approach. But even the Guardian is being racist and being protective and shielding the Brenda family from the correct accusation of having been racist. Remember what the mother of Stephen Lawrence, Doreen Lawrence, has said about the new documentary on his murder. She has said things have not changed. Well, she's being modest, but things have changed in the opposite direction. That is to say, the racism in the police, as Kathy Newman has kind of partially recognized in her promotion of Palm Samdu, the racism of the Metropolitan Police has got worse, has been getting worse by the day. So people who kind of jumped on the bandwagon in 1993 when, in April 1993, when the bandwagon was being, if you like, mobilized after the racist murdered Stephen Lawrence in Eltham in southeast London. There was this predictable racist diversion being orchestrated by those vultures, those racist vultures like Michael Mansfield, the licensed law trader, who eventually staged his own coup to hijack one part of the, let's say, bandwagon in order to capitalize strictly in CB terms, because Mansfield knew that there was not going to be a big loot for him financially by getting involved apparently on the side of the family of the victim of the murder. But the importance for Michael Mansfield in being seen as being part of the campaign against the racism was to be calculated in the CB enhancement. He could say, I was part of the leading campaigners for justice for Stephen Lawrence. And that would be worth millions of pounds for him in other cases. Take that point. So we are saying that Michael Mansfield is a vulture. And Mansfield, according to the Daily Mail and others of their ilk, is among the, if not the, most, quote, prominent left-wing senior, quote, barristers. There is nobody more senior than Michael Mansfield. But if you look at the record of Mansfield utterances, you find that Mansfield is part of the status quo. Mansfield is part of the racist status quo. So he's a very successful auteur provocateur. He's the one that poses to be on the side of the victims, the oppressed, the denied, while undermining everything significant and torpedoing the credible mounting and sustenance of a campaign for justice against racism and racist institutions and individuals. And that's how he has been operating. And that's how all the so-called left-wing lawyers have been operating. For example, I mentioned earlier, not today in this edition, but in previous editions, I've discussed Anthony Lester. Anthony Lester and Jeffrey Bindman, I recognize for simply strictly on the basis of reference, not on the basis of any qualitative acceptance of their core kind of function and contribution. I don't accept them as having made the core contribution towards even identifying the British judicial bureaucracies as being fundamentally racist, fundamentally corrupt, fundamentally dishonest, and therefore fundamentally a collection of dens of prostitution, brothels. When I say brothels, I actively think of the utterances attributed by the London Evening, no standards, to David Neuberger. David Neuberger is on the record as the first incumbent or the first person to be appointed the president of the Supreme Court, which was launched not long ago. And Neuberger said in 2017, somewhere in London, that after Brexit became operational, London, he didn't say UK, he didn't say Britain, he said London would become the center of the world's most lucrative litigation business. That is to say, people with lots and lots of money would flock to Britain, London, and file cases against one another in various disputes. What he was referring to was, in effect, collections of billionaires and big crooks and thieves and robbers belonging to various other countries. So Jeffrey Bindman didn't talk about similar attitude held by post holders in the judicial bureaucracy in the decades before Neuberger made the confession. Because Bindman and Lester, who is now deceased at this date, were actually the joint writers and authors of the book about law and race. Law and Race is probably the first such collection to be published in Britain about racism in the UK and by the British Empire. Let's see if I can find a sign of that one. All right. So this is a description of that book called Race and Law, and the authors are listed as Anthony Lester and Jeffrey Bindman, London, Penguin Books, 1972, and it had 492 pages, three appendices, and it was priced as $425. Now it says, on its cover, this book is described as the first comprehensive account of the background to and operation of the Race Relations Acts of the United Kingdom. Now, I said that was the first such book. It's appropriate to say that that is the extent to which this applies. Not only because it is so comprehensive, but also because the authors give numerous illustrations of present and possible future elaboration of United Kingdom race relations legislation. The publishers' rather pretentious claim that Race and Law is a landmark in our knowledge and understanding of civil rights is well substantiated, at least with respect to civil rights in the United Kingdom. The scope of this study is perhaps best stated by the authors themselves. Quote, this book deals with a complicated and controversial subject, the use of the law to combat racial discrimination and prejudice, or expressing the same idea positively, the use of law to promote equality of opportunity and treatment regardless of race. So that is the book which I shall quote from later, especially about Macaulay, because I came across, in the context of the law and legislation, in a book authored by any British writers, I came across Macaulay's particular quote that I have been quoting since. And I came across that book that I bought shortly after it was published in the 1970s, let's say. So from the 1970s, I've been quoting that because that has been so significant a part of what the thinking was in the 19th century England about the empire, what they were going to do to the empire. So it was 1830s that Macaulay and his education, India education legislation was published. And what Macaulay said still is relevant and still active. Now, here is a piece that I should read in the context of the emphatic identification of racism as the single most important factor in British policy and politics and corruption and status quo. This is the bit from the website academic.oup.com. And I'm reading part of the paragraph. It seems fitting to consider how far statues and public memorials in the nation's capital, that is London, represent Britain's involvement in both transatlantic slavery and its abolition. London was the largest slaving port in late Stuart times, and the city of London remained the commercial center of what was, by the Georgian era, the world's premier slaving nation. Despite this, London's public monuments and their connections with slavery have remained curiously under-researched. Yet, as this article will first demonstrate, a significant proportion of the individuals commemorated by public statues in London during the long 18th century had important links with the slave trade or plantation slavery. Such links need to be unearthed, contextualized, and made explicit. As Seymour Drescher has remarked, monuments alone will not, in themselves, stimulate a constant rethinking of the past. That remains the task of historians. Now, that is only a part of the article from a journal. It's not from the newspapers. But the newspapers about history is on the front page of today's Guardian, which says archives reveal ban on black staff at the palace. Now, anyone who has direct experience of trying to personally access the collections of the what is now the British Library, or British Museum, the newspaper library combined, the British Library based in Euston. It used to be near on a location nearby, but not too near. But this is currently the biggest building, a collection containing the biggest collection, let's say, of the British Library is based in Euston, between Euston and King's Cross in central London. Anyone who has tried to physically access the collection would know that it's a formidable obstacle created by those who control the access. And access to people of African and Asian identity or appearance or background is made all the more difficult. What that means is that it would be wasting your time if you are African or Asian. So you'd need to have an alternative collection of your own. Think about the alternative and the cost and the time and the scale of the task. We shall come back to that again, because that is exactly what I have been engaged in trying to build up over decades. That is the reason. And what you find in the collection are things like no other collection has history of action and lives of people. And it's not mechanical. It's very much individually focused and based on dedication that is not available anywhere. You cannot pay for it to have it. It's unique in the purest and the most authentic sense of the term unique. So I have been engaged in creating this in the UK over the last 50 years. And mainly trying to use locations based in Tower Hamlets. Mainly, not entirely, because some of the locations have been in three other London boroughs in the east of London or in East London. Waltham Forest, Redbridge, and Newham. In fact, 4, Barking and Dagenham. So what the archives, National Archives, reveal how in 1968, the Queen's chief financial manager informed civil servants that it was not in fact the practice to appoint colored immigrants or foreigners to clerical roles in the royal household. And read the, quote, humorous rest of this sentence. Although colored immigrants or foreigners were permitted to work as domestic servants, it is unclear when the practice ended. Buckingham Palace refused to answer questions about the ban, and when it was revoked, it said its records showed people from minority ethnic backgrounds being employed in the 1990s. It added that before that decade, it did not keep records on the racial backgrounds of employees. Well, one answer to that lie is that there was no need for such records because there were no colored immigrants or foreigners present. All the employees were white, so there was no need for any classification. There was only one class. So the Guardian piece says, in the 1960s, government ministers sought to introduce laws that would make it illegal to refuse to employ an individual on the grounds of their race or ethnicity. The Queen has remained personally exempted from those equality laws for more than 4 decades. The exemption has made it impossible for women or people from ethnic minorities working for her household to complain to the courts if they believe they have been discriminated against. Well, that is wrong of the Guardian. Why? Because as the United Kingdom is a signatory to anti-racist international treaties and obligations under them, the United Kingdom's head of state has to be subject to litigation. So that's the Guardian repeating the lying and ignorance and stupidity. That's the 2-page spread that they're running about the subject on the inside. Subject of the archives, rebuilding ban on black staff at the palace. Now, what this raises, of course, is the question of why one of the heirs to the throne, Diana's elder son, says that his family has no racism, or there is no racism in his family. Are they going to ask him the question about all these? Is he going to say that the family has not had such racist barriers and denials? So when the Guardian appears almost kind of fit for purpose in some issues, it fails. It fails the test. So when the corrupt mayor imposed at the expense of tar hamlers, Lutfur Rahman, was asked on film or on the record, let's say, in the morning of Tuesday, the 15th of February, 2011, in Brick Lane. When I asked him if he knew how bad the Tar Hamlers Council crooks were, and did he realize that the Tar Hamlers Council crooks were engaged in doing serious damage to the whole community in Tar Hamlers, Lutfur Rahman did not deny that I was talking about a very serious issue or serious issues. And he gave me the assurance as we spoke in Brick Lane that he would meet me as a matter of urgency if I contacted him, which I did. We shall continue